Hi there, it's Jennifer McGuire. Today's technique is called Monochromatic Ink Layering. This is a great way to stretch the inks that you probably already have and get a beautiful kind of dimensional looking monochromatic stamped card. For this, you just need one color of ink along with some other basic supplies and you get really cool results. Now, all of the cards I created today use some of the images from the new Hero Art My Monthly Hero Kit for July. It has this 6x8 stamp set, coordinating dies, and some accessories, along with an ombre ink pad. There are other pieces that you can get to order separately along with it, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. For this, I have cut some white cardstock. I use Nina white cardstock, but you could try this technique with whatever cardstock you have. Now, for this technique to work, you need to use Hero Art's shadow ink. It's got to say that keyword shadow on it, and I think it's best to use darker colors of ink. I'm going to start with this example here, and you'll see why you need to use this ink. There are other lines of ink out there, such as Simon Says Stamp Ink and W+9 ink that will work for this technique also. Okay, so I'm using Hero Art Shadow Ink in the Tide Pool color. This is a little bit darker. Medium to dark is what you need. And I am going to press this ink pad to completely cover that white cardstock. I am really being generous with this ink. The more ink you put down, the better this technique will work. Okay, so now while this is still wet, it will kind of soften and even out. I'm going to stamp on it with VersaMark ink. I'm using some of the coral from that stamp set that I showed you. And I'm going to stamp this onto this inked background. You will not see it at first. So see, you don't see anything there, but I promise what happens is that VersaMark reacts with that shadow ink and you'll see the color change. This was actually something that my friend Christina Warner told me about. And I think she discovered it by accident, and she told me about it, and I did it in one of the online card classes, and I thought I'd share a little variation of that here today. So big shout out to Christina Warner, and I will link to her YouTube channel also. Okay, so I've stamped some coral. This time I'm stamping the bottom layer of the big jellyfish that's in that stamp set, and also a little turtle. Now you'll notice that the coral's starting to show up there on the bottom. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of move that along. If you set this aside to dry on its own, that reaction would take place and the areas that you stamp the VersaMark would actually lighten. But I'm going to speed it up by using my heat gun. So there's really nothing wet here. All I'm doing is kind of heat setting that Tide Pool ink in the background, making it dry and soften, and check it out, that VersaMark pops out. So you can see it just kind of looks like a tone-on-tone watermark look on there. But all we used was the Tide Pool ink in the background and VersaMark ink on top. And VersaMark ink is an ink that many people already have in their stash. Okay, so now we have that first kind of layer of stamping that's very soft, and it's so beautiful in real life. It kind of has a velvety look to it. Now for the next layer, I'm going to use another ink that is kind of a staple that many of us have, and that is a white pigment ink. I like the Hero Arts Unicorn White Pigment ink, but any white pigment ink would work for this. So I'm going to stamp some of the other images, including a larger coral image and the second layer of that jellyfish right on top of the first. So you could now have another layer of look here, another layer of dimension with that white pigment ink on the colored background. This white pigment ink is a little bit more vivid than what we got from the VersaMark. So you have kind of another layered look here. Now you could leave it this way and kind of heat set it, but what I decided to do was put some Perfect Pearl pigment powder on it. Now before I do that, I'm going to kind of dab any of the excess ink off. I really want to kind of soften this a little bit, so I'm just dabbing it with the dry cloth. And now I'm going to bring in the Perfect Pearl pigment powder. So this is a product from Ranger, and what you do is you use a brush and you just kind of tap some on. Just a little bit is all you need, and you tap it over the areas that are wet. So the areas we put that white pigment ink, because that white pigment ink will stay wet for a little bit. So I've tapped some on there, and now I'm going to use a dry cloth to kind of wipe the excess away here. Now I decided I wanted to have more shine. See the shine on that coral there? I decided I wanted to do the same for that jellyfish. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp that jellyfish with the white pigment ink. I mentioned this earlier, but I didn't actually do it earlier. I'm going to stamp that second layer of jellyfish right on top with that white pigment ink. And you'll see that really makes that jellyfish pop. However, I want to really add some shine to it. So after dabbing off a little bit of the excess with my dry cloth, I'm going to go to it with some of that Perfect Pearl. Now, Perfect Pearls has a built-in binder, and when it contacts with moisture, it stays put. And so the moisture in that ink, I think, is enough to hold it on. I noticed that this really didn't rub off, so you don't have to worry about it coming off in the envelope. It really adds an amazing amount of shine to it. I just use my brush to knock off the excess. And then I usually like to heat it at this point. I like to add a little bit of heat to it so that white pigment ink dries, holding on to that Perfect Pearl. Then I wipe extra off with my dry cloth. So you can kind of play around with this ink layering. You can use the Perfect Pearl on some parts of it, but not others. You can use the VersaMark, the white pigment ink. You can do anything you want here, and you get all this layered look, like of dimension, just using that one color of ink along with a few other staples like the VersaMark, the white pigment ink, and that Perfect Pearl pigment powder. And by the way, the Perfect Pearl pigment powder that I'm using is the basic color. It's kind of just an opaly look, and it's called Perfect Pearl Color of Perfect Pearls. That's kind of confusing. Okay, so now I'm going to add a sentiment. I'm using this. This is from a seahorse stamp set that Hero Arts released a while ago. I used my anti-static powder tool on this, and now I've stamped it with VersaMark, and I'm going to add some white embossing powder to this. I decided to only white heat emboss this layer so that the sentiment stood out, but you could add even more layers to that background with clear or white embossing powder. And check out the shine that you get on there from that Perfect Pearl. Okay, I decided to use the bubbles from this octopus stamp set. You'll see this octopus stamp set a little bit later. I'll talk about it then. But I like the bubbles in it. So what I'm doing is using that same Tide Pool ink to stamp these on the background. So we're going to get a little bit darker look here. So basically, it's Tide Pool ink on top of Tide Pool ink. So it's just getting a little bit darker. This is yet another way to add another layer of inking to this background. So still, we've only used one color of ink. Make sure it's a shadow ink, and then VersaMark ink and white pigment ink. So you can use that VersaMark ink and white pigment ink with any color shadow ink to create these layered backgrounds. To make this piece pop out, I decided to use an ink blending tool and that same color Tide Pool ink and put it along the edges, just so it has a nice darker edge. And we'll put this onto a white note card a little bit later in this video. So before I show you how I finished off this card, I want to show you a few other examples using different stamps and different colors of shadow inks. For this example, the octopus card, I used a different color background, but again, I used the VersaMark ink, Perfect Pearl, and white pigment ink. So here I'm using the Hero Arts Shadow Ink. This is an emerald green color. Now remember, this starts out very dark at first, but as it absorbs into the paper and dries, it'll soften slightly. So always keep that in mind. Again, right away, I'm stamping with the VersaMark ink. If you watch those images, those VersaMark stamped images, you'll see the colors start to change. This octopus stamp set is an additional stamp set that you can get, like an add-on item for this month's kit. So be sure to check it out. Now that I've stamped those first images with the VersaMark, I'm just going to heat it so it speeds it up. And with this particular color of ink, it kind of changes to a bluish color underneath when you stamp with the VersaMark on top. And I just think that's gorgeous. It's fun to experiment with the different colors of shadow ink to see how they all react differently to that VersaMark on top. Now this time I'm using the second layer of that octopus image and I'm stamping it with the white pigment ink right on top. And look how right away it looks absolutely gorgeous. I'm going to stamp some additional images with the white pigment ink, and then we'll put the same Perfect Pearl on top of that. Now, by the way, I mentioned earlier, you need to do this with Hero Arts Shadow Inks. There are other ink formulations that are very similar that will work, such as the Simon Says Stamp dye inks and W+9 dye inks. I encourage you, if you don't have any of those inks, to experiment with what you have. Inks you may have already will work with this technique. You just got to give it a try. I don't have all the inks out there. But really, all you need to do is take some of the ink, smear it on white cardstock, stamp VersaMark on it, and heat set it and see what happens if a reaction takes place. I just love how with this particular formulation, when you stamp with VersaMark on top, it softens and slightly changes the color. Okay, so there we have the results on the darker color. I really believe this works best with the darkest colors of shadow ink. So like this emerald, you can see how the color or the layers kind of pop out so much. Again, I use my anti-static powder tool and I stamped the sentiment Go With The Flow with VersaMark ink and added white embossing powder on top, just so that white sentiment really pops out with the colors that we have going on in the background. Again, I'm using the little bubbles to stamp here. You'll see later I put glossy accents on these, but at this point I was thinking I was going to keep this card pretty flat and simple, so that tone-on-tone look looks nice too. Okay, let's do a few more examples. This uses a navy shadow ink with the turtle image that you saw in that My Monthly Hero kit that I showed you at the beginning of this video. So I have white cardstock. I'm just putting a ton of that navy ink down, and I'll start with stamping with the VersaMark ink on top of that. After I've stamped a few images with the VersaMark ink, I'm going to go ahead and heat that to kind of move things along, and you can see those images pop out. Next, I'm going to stamp the turtle. There you can see the stamp set there on the top left with white pigment ink. This is not a layered image. It's just one solid image. So I decided to stamp that with the white ink. You could leave it like that if you wanted to, but I decided to go ahead and put that Perfect Pearl powder on it again, just so it adds that shimmer to it. This little jar of Perfect Pearls is very inexpensive and lasts forever, and there are so many things you can do with it. You can add it to water for a shimmer spray. You can use it how I used it today. It's a great product to have. Okay, so another color example here. This time I'm using a really bright blue color called Cornflower. This is another Hero Arts shadow ink. And I'm going to use the Hero Arts Goldfish stamp set. I've used this stamp set in past videos, and I thought it was perfect to use for today's technique. So this stamp set is one where you want to layer two images on top of each other once again. So I did the bottom layer with the VersaMark ink. And then after we heat set that and watch those images kind of pop out, we're going to go ahead and stamp the next layer on top with the white pigment ink, and then add the Perfect Pearls to it. I am speeding up through this process because it's the exact same on all of them. I just wanted to show you a variation in the ink color and the stamp set used. So this Hero Arts Goldfish stamp set is one that's been around for a while, and I thought it was fun to mix it up with the My Monthly Hero kit that I'm featuring today. And by the way, the My Monthly Hero kit is something that is like a one-time thing. Once they're sold out, they won't have anymore, so you want to be sure to grab it early. I know people have asked about that in the past. Okay, so a couple more examples. This one, I kind of did a variation of color. So after first putting down that Tide Pool ink, like the first example I showed you in this video, I went ahead and used an ink blending tool to add a little bit of the blue, that bright blue cornflower ink here and there on the background. So you can do a variation of color, but I always encourage you to first saturate the background with a lot of the shadow ink. The more ink you put down on that background, the more that your technique will pop out, so that VersaMark will react more and really give better results. So I wanted to blend those two colors together, but I started out with the Tide Pool Solid, and then I blended in some cornflower on top. Again, I'm using that goldfish stamp set. This time I'm using the smaller goldfish in the set. Did the VersaMark images first. Now we'll stamp the pigment ink on top of that and add the Perfect Pearls on top. Remember, there are additional layers you can do to this monochromatic look. You could do clear embossing on top of it, or sparkle clear embossing powder on top. You can really add to this with that one basic color underneath, or two as I did here. Again, I just white heat embossed the sentiment so that it would stand out also. Now, one final example I wanted to show you. I kind of got carried away with these. This time, I'm going to do a background stamp over the whole inked background. So I'm starting out once again with the Tide Pool ink, really saturating that paper. After I've had it completely inked up, I'm going to come in with the emerald ink, which is a little bit darker, and an ink blending tool, and kind of do an ombre look. So I'm going to have some of the dark color towards the bottom of this panel. Then I'm going to take a Hero Arts background stamp. This is the wave background stamp. I thought this was perfect for these ocean backgrounds. So I'm going to ink this up with VersaMark ink and stamp it over that ink that we've created on that piece there. This will slowly, of course, react with that ink underneath, and you'll get these subtle waves in the background. I also decided to stamp the first layer of the seahorse. This is another stamp set that's been out for a while with Hero Arts. Thought it went well with today's monthly Hero Arts kit. I'm going to stamp the first layer with the VersaMark ink, and then we're going to heat this so that we can see that reaction kind of pop out here. So you could just create a basic background where you really heavily ink some white cardstock with a shadow ink, and then stamp with VersaMark any background image on top and create just a nice subtle look. Here I'm doing a lot of stamping and a lot of layering, but you could really simplify this if you want to. So I went ahead and did the additional layers of that seahorse added some perfect pearls, and then we ended up with a very simple version of this technique. I didn't do any coral or anything else with it. I did white heat emboss a sentiment, but to be honest with you, I was running out of time at this point, so I just went ahead and kept it very simple. Okay, so now let's go ahead and wrap up these cards. I have some top folding 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note cards that I created, and also some small pieces of white craft foam. This has a little dimension to it, and I'm putting adhesive on both sides, and I'll glue that between our stamped panels and the note card. So we have nice, even raised dimension that'll hold up as it goes through the mail. So this is all I'm doing. I could have done something to that white note card, maybe done some white on white heat embossing, or some embossing folders, but I decided to keep it very simple and keep the focus on all that ink layering that we did in the center. I also decided to add drops of glossy accents onto the little bubbles, just for a little bit of dimension. And what's really neat is that sometimes the glossy accents reacts with the shadow ink underneath and changes color a little bit. This is something that my friend Heather discovered, and I'll link to her YouTube channel also. And she told me about, and I'd forgotten about the technique until I saw the card that I did today. So if you look closely in this picture here, you'll see the bubbles kind of changed colors. It also gives a little bit of dimension to the card. So there you have a bunch of examples of ink layering with shadow inks. I encourage you to take whatever inks you have and play with them. See what kind of reactions you can get so that you can do some ink layering like this. It's a great way to stretch your inks and your stamps. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. All the supplies are linked in my YouTube description. Also, you can head over to my blog by clicking here at the top left, and you can get much more information there along with a giveaway. In the middle are 3 other videos. The first one shows another example using the goldfish stamp set. The middle one shows another example using perfect pearls, and the last one is another monochromatic ink video. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll return again soon.